biological, radioactives, any kind of radiation as the sun.
Okay.
And safety, the condition of being protected from a danger situation or risk. And we were talking about Marie Curie, the conditions in her work. She didn't have all the equipment for her protection.
Okay.
We were talking about that.
Okay.
We need equipment to protect ourselves.
Okay, thank you. Another group would like to give us feedback? Okay.
Okay. And in our case, our team, we're discussing about the work conditions.
Yeah.
Because we have a few years ago a lot of mine slurries.
Yeah.
And obviously injuries from that kind of things without protection, with the right equipment in order to be safe in these work conditions. We don't have that. But also discussions about injuries and sickness
Yep.
because of this kind of work conditions.
Okay.
But that's also we talk about vaccines, hygiene, shift of 8 hours that we don't have in those days, age of laboring because infant is still using for that kind of works, hazard of chemical agents or biological materials. That also is possible to be in contact with that kind of materials.
Okay, thank you very much. How about this group? Yes.
Well, we were discussing more like the definition of health being like a well-being, a physical well-being, and the absence of sickness. And well, the safety part would be preserving our physical integrity. And so in legislation, that would be all of the rules required to maintain both of these standards in our workplace. And well, historically, it's been an ongoing thing since mostly the Industrial Revolution, how they started eliminating child work and then doing the weekend, establishing different things that are meant to maintain our health and safety. But yeah, just general discussion.
Thank you very much. Are there any other groups that want to give us some feedback? Yes, over there. I can take the microphone. Yes, this group? The same as that one. How about in the middle here? Similar, okay.
Thank you. Morning. We discussed about the context. Unfortunately, in the past, we discussed about the health and safety. It was a topic that it was not clear for many reasons. So I think that now, with the progress of the companies, think in this area as an investment to take care about the context for health and safety, and not like in the past when many companies looked like it was a leak of money. So I think that there is some kind of progress of the
Okay. So companies recognizing that it's a strategic investment. Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. All of them are useful ideas. I had put down a few things. I think you've covered most of them. Things like historically, we didn't get holidays. We didn't get work breaks. We didn't have lunch times. Now we have, if you're driving a big lorry, there's a tachograph that measures how long you've been driving for. The one many of us find very difficult is all the health and safety guidance about using a computer says you mustn't spend more than an hour and a half, 2 hours, and then you must have a break. I think most of us just sit on a computer for 8 hours a day with no break sometimes. You need to be careful of that one. Children not being forced to work, that's a very interesting discussion. The International Labour Organization definitely wants children below a certain age not to work. But what about if you grow up on a farm or your parents run a shop? Surely you're going to do some things to help them, feed the chickens or deliver newspapers or something. So it's a very contentious issue about children not working. But for most of us, the idea of children being forced to work in mines, particularly as they used to be historically, and doing dangerous activities, really that's a thing of the past. The provision of safety equipment, yes. It's surprising how many places still individuals are required to provide their own equipment. A very upsetting one for us is the British Army. The soldiers have to buy their own boots. The army doesn't give them boots. You would have thought this would have been a standard issue piece of equipment. But, you know, there are many places where someone doing a specialist job has to bring their own equipment with them, still today. Rules for safe handling of materials, yes. We talked about nuclear, chemicals, other things. But I think also we didn't talk much about ergonomics, how that's well established. You know, you're seating in comfortable seats, at desks, well-lit environment, good ventilation, those sorts of things. What about your work environment? Is it secure and safe? You know, if you're dealing with a lot of people, they can get aggressive. How do you protect someone? For instance, if you're in the airport, your flight is cancelled, you want to go and shout at the people from the airline desk. How do you protect those people? So you need to think about some sort of physical barrier, just like a simple desk, maybe to protect them. The provision of hygiene facilities, bathrooms, washing facilities, health checks. Someone mentioned that again for the nuclear industry, but also that's becoming more and more common that companies provide systems of general health checks for employees. And wellness and well-being, I think this group mentioned it. What do we mean by wellness and well-being? It's sort of trying to stop people from smoking, cut down on drinking, eat less, take more exercise. One of the questions we have is how far are companies responsible for pushing wellness and well-being, or how much is it the responsibility of the individual to take care of those issues themselves? You know, generally in society we're seeing you may not smoke in public areas. So society is moving in one direction, but still the number of smokers is not going down very much as a percentage of population. So what is happening there? There seems to be conflict. And what about stress? Someone mentioned it, but how many of you are going to deal with work telephone calls during these 4 days of the session? How many of you answer email at midnight? You know, do you sit in front of the TV on Sunday evening? You're having your dinner, but your laptop is on, you're trying to clear the email ready for Monday morning. You know, some of these tools are wonderful, but being alive 24 hours a day or on call 24 hours a day, is proving stressful. I believe in Mexico you might be about to introduce legislation that says you cannot be contacted by your boss on Saturday or Sunday. Wow, I wish I had that, but yeah. But then it starts looking at things like unreasonable workloads. How do you determine what is a reasonable workload? So in many organizations, when someone leaves for whatever reason, you have to transfer their work and share it amongst their colleagues until a replacement can be found. But how long does that go on for? Is it a month? Is it 3 months? Is it a year? Sometimes companies, you go, oh, we've transferred all the work to other people. They can become more productive rather than employing new people. What about the culture within your organization? How do you deal with bosses who seem to be bullying you or uncooperative work colleagues? What about lack of transparency in the way decisions are made about your work and your situation? I'm going through a reorganization at the moment. We have them. About every 7 years, bosses feel they need to reorganize us. So we can predict this is happening. But are we consulted? Do we have any say in the outcome? If what we're told we're going to be doing in the future, are we allowed to say, I don't like that? You know, what is the degree of transparency and openness that you have? These can add to stress in the workplace. Lack of willingness to accept criticism in your work situation. Are you allowed to say to your boss, I think you're doing something wrong? You know, is the communication process two-way? And victimization, again, that's part of the bullying and the culture within the organization. So there are many things. I think we've picked up quite a few from the historical side about holidays and work breaks, which were aimed at making sure people stayed fit and healthy and able to continue doing the job. There's an interesting story in the UK. We had a war in about 1820, the Crimean War, and at that time, the generals couldn't find enough fit people to use as soldiers. So they then started a social program of giving free milk to families for the children and to try and make the mothers stay at home to make sure they produce good, fit soldiers. And you think that's one of the origins of our social security system, is just to provide soldiers to go and be killed in the army? It's a crazy system. But that's it. But also for you as universities, you have a very strange system or situation. I remember talking with the Director of Health and Safety from the University of Singapore, and he said, I have faculty members doing research on things they have no understanding of, things like nanotechnology. He says, I have to put them in triple security systems because they don't know what the effects these microparticles are going to have. No one can predict what the effects of those are. Or someone dealing with some of the nuclear stuff. Do you really know what it's going to do? You mentioned Marie Curie and not having the correct equipment. Well, okay, we understand that part, but some of these new particles that people are investigating, do we know what they will do? So universities are very interesting places depending on the research you're doing and how you control that. But then again, you also have students who like using things like carbon dioxide fire extinguishers to cool down their cans of Coca-Cola. So how do you prevent them using the equipment you've provided in the incorrect way? You know, that's a very difficult situation for you. So I wish you luck in those aspects. Okay, I think we covered some good, interesting ideas about what health and safety is. So let's look at what was considered the first safety legislation by Hammurabi, the emperor of Babylon, who said if someone builds a house but does not make his work strong, with the result the house which he built collapses and so causes the death of the owner of the house, the builder shall be put to death. Lovely statement. But what that is really is, it's an example of what we refer to as contemporary legislation. Because it tells you what you have to do, but not how to do it. And really that's how we write standards. Yesterday I mentioned about performance-based standards. And that's really what we want legislation for health and safety to do. In the UK, historically, some of our first legislation was about the morals of apprentices. They thought that people with poor morals, not going to church every week or drinking a lot, was contributing to dangerous activities. And in between that first piece of legislation in about 1802, we had several acts concerning safety in mines and safeties in factories. And then really we had a critical piece of legislation in 1974, which set the modern direction for health and safety. And interestingly, when that was revised in 1999, in that intervening period between 1974 and 1999, there was an increased emphasis on how health and safety is managed. So the legislation actually refers to management systems for health and safety in that period. And we actually started standardization in about 1992 for health and safety. And I just put a small note about a Homicide Act in 2007, because what we found, there was a big accident. A ferry had left the port with the front door of the ferry open, and the ferry sank very quickly, and many people were killed. But there was no way of prosecuting the directors of the company or the people responsible, because with corporations you have a system of the corporation has a virtual identity, and you prosecute that virtual identity. It's very rare that you prosecute individuals within the corporation. And so this act was introduced to try and overcome that issue, to say directors are personally responsible for health and safety. I don't quite know what the legal situation in Mexico is. I guess you're struggling with the same issues. But looking at the background, from statistics from a couple of years ago, 7,500 people die every day from health and safety at work related issues. And most of those are dying from illnesses. Very few, or proportionately, are dying from accidents. And in total, about 2.78 million deaths every year. That's huge. So work-related mortality is 5% of the global total deaths. Diseases are 2.4 million, and accidents 13.7. And non-fatal incidents, or non-fatal accidents, about 374 million a year. That's huge. You know, what can we do to reduce that? So these statistics are from the 2017 survey. One of the issues we're looking at is, you know, if health is the prime problem, what are the health issues that we need to look at? And the World Health Organization lists these items as occupational diseases. So lung disease, cancer, noise, musculoskeletal, skin, stress, hand-arm vibration. And then more recently, chronic pulmonary disease and asthma. And interestingly, when they added COPD and asthma, that increased the number of reported deaths from 2.3 million in 2014 to 2.78 million now. So, you know, those two diseases account for quite a lot. When we look at the distribution worldwide, you can see that Asia is the main area where accidents and deaths occur. I actually think this is a very unfair representation of the issue, because if you break this down by population size, you know, per head of population, the number of accidents are worst in America and Europe. Do you think Asia includes China and India and Indonesia, which have huge populations? So percentage-wise, yes, the total figures show that Asia is the worst, but actually it's the developed countries which are still having problems if you do it on a per capita basis. So some of the benefits that have been identified of using a formal management system to try and manage health and safety are things like the improved ability to respond to regulatory issues, the reduced overall costs when incidents occur. Because when an incident occurs, you've got to clean up, you've got to fix things, you may have to pay compensation, the costs are reduced. Also, when an incident occurs, the time it takes to get back to operating again is reduced, so the downtime is reduced. We're seeing companies that are achieving probably 4 or 5% reduction in their insurance premiums by having a formal system. And if you think for some of these big companies, the insurance premiums are millions of dollars, so to save 4 or 5% because you have a good system is helpful. We're seeing actually within the labor forces, people are happier to go to work. So we see reduced absenteeism and reduced employee turnover rates. And finally, you know, there's recognition for having achieved some sort of benchmark that's recognized internationally. And if you're supplying to other larger companies, they take note of that because it helps them defend their business reputations. And also we've seen in courts, courts when they put fines on companies because there's been a safety incident, they tend to say, well, we've seen that you've tried to be proactive about managing your health and safety, but okay, accidents still occur. That's a fact of life. But we note that you've been proactive, so we're going to give you reduced fines. So those are all useful benefits of health and safety systems. So let me now start talking about ISO 45001 itself. Okay? In the UK, BSI started its standards development process back in the 1970s, and in fact we had a standard BS 5750, which was published in 1979, and that was then sent to ISO, and it eventually became the basis for ISO 9001. Similarly, in about 1992, we had a standard BS 7750, which got sent to ISO and became the basis for ISO 14001. And everyone had an expectation that we would develop a BS 8750 for health and safety. But we didn't get agreement within our national committee for that. They said, no, we don't want a document that can be used for certification. So we produced instead a guidance standard, BS 8800, and that was published in 1996. Soon after it was published, ISO held a workshop, and the workshop was about, should ISO start producing standards in the health and safety field? There were about 200 people there, and very intense discussions, but at the end of the day, they had to conclude that the timing was not right for developing health and safety standards. I mean, there were some people who were adamant ISO should never develop health and safety standards, but ISO very clearly said, no, the timing is not yet right. And then in 1997, the International Labour Organization proposed a joint development of a health and safety standard to ISO. But some of the national standards bodies were a bit concerned about the processes that the International Labour Organization uses for developing its documents. So instead, they said, well, why don't we take this British standard 8800 and use that as the basis for an ISO project? Unfortunately, it was not approved. ISO has certain rules about the percentage votes that have to approve a new work item. And that one was 60% in favor and 40% against. But we needed to get 66% in favor. So you can see it was a close margin, but still there was a certain percentage who said no. As a result of that, we created something called the OSAS Project Group outside of ISO with international members from some of the standards bodies who'd voted in favor of producing an ISO standard, some of the certification bodies, some health and safety institutes, and we created a standard called OSAS 18001, and that was first published in 1999. But the International Labour Organization had not stopped in its idea of progressing the development of a standard, so in 2001 it produced its own guidelines document. And continuing the history, you can see that a number of countries like Australia, China, the USA, they all started producing their own standards. A couple of years later, the US was quite interesting because one of the concerns they'd had was about a standard might give the unions too much power over an organization. But when they saw that the 18001 standard was not written in a way to do that, it was really focusing about how do you manage health and safety, they decided to copy the model, but not exactly. The Americans like to do it their way. In 2005, the BS 8800 standard was again proposed to ISO after it had been revised, but it took 2 years before ISO made a decision that no, it wasn't suitable, the timing still wasn't right to start doing work. So the OSAS project group revised its 18001 document to make sure it aligned with a new edition of 14001. And then we saw many other national standards being produced based on that standard. After 5 years, so from 2007 to 2012, we came to the formal review point for 18001, and we decided to see if ISO would accept a new proposal. And what we'd found by then is that there was something like 90,000 companies using 18001 that got certified to it in 127 different countries. And you say, logically, this has got to become an international standard. So we went back to ISO and we said, come on, we have the data to show this is a de facto international standard. You must look at this again. And so a proposal was submitted. Finally, it was accepted. In fact, it took a letter from the Secretary General of ISO to say it's acceptable for ISO to do work in this field, for many members to change their votes to one of approval. And then a project committee was established, and after various drafts, finally in 2018, we published the ISO 45001. So the question is, why has it taken so long? 20 years. I mean, really, did it need to take that amount of time? And there are several reasons why. I've mentioned some countries like the US were very concerned about the balance of power between company managers and unions. They were very concerned that standards would give the unions too much control. Some countries, like Germany, were very worried about universal health and safety practices. Germany spends a lot of time training people. They have very good apprentice training programs. And as a consequence, when you see machinery in many factories, it doesn't have some of the automatic safeguards that I would expect to find in a UK factory or you might expect to find in a factory in Mexico. They say, we have trained our people how to use the equipment safely. And they were worried that if they had to adopt international practices, they would have to spend a fortune changing all of their manufacturing equipment. So they had real financial concerns about the change. Others, like the International Labour Organization and the International Trades Union Congress, were very concerned about the way that ISO works. ISO is based on national representatives being sent to do work. Whereas the ILO and the ITUC work very strictly in a tripartite system. So they work with government, industry, and labor as the three parties that negotiate any agreement. And they weren't satisfied that that process would be repeated. So a main concern from them. And then finally, there were concerns about the value of certification. You know, they're saying, well, we've seen how ISO 9001 works, we've seen how ISO 14001 works. Are we certain we want that in health and safety? You know, we're dealing with life here and people's lives. Do we really want a system of third-party people checking companies and saying they're okay? Do we have enough trust in the system that that will work? So there were four main reasons why many people were concerned about the project starting. But we succeeded. We eventually got it published. And so what are the key perspectives? It's obviously to help organizations eliminate or minimize the risks of harm, either by ill health or injury, to all those working under their control by taking appropriate preventive measures, to provide a platform for continual improvement in health and safety performance, to integrate health and safety within an organization's business management system, and to be aligned with other ISO management standards, particularly the ISO 14000 health environmental standard. That's because we know that many companies tend to have a single role for health and safety and environment. They try to manage those two areas together. So for this reason, in writing 45001, we were following the ISO 14001 standard very closely. And I think that relationship will continue in the future. It follows this common structure I talked about yesterday, the high-level structure for ISO standards. It's risk-based. It emphasizes the critical importance of leadership. It requires active participation and consultation of workers. And it uses a similar approach to 18001, which has now been around for about 20 years. So you're not seeing huge changes. Those companies that have been using the 18001, it's a migration, it's not a complete revolution. It emphasizes the need to prevent ill health, including mental ill health as well as injuries. And it requires you to recognize that the causes of ill health can be through immediate impacts, such as accidents, or through longer-term impacts, such as repeated exposure to carcinogenic materials, nuclear material, or even to a stressful working environment. Those are the issues that can affect people. I talked a little bit about linking to strategic direction. What is a simplified definition of strategic direction? If you're talking about companies, most companies, they're either trying to increase their market share, or they're trying to maintain their market share, or in some situations they recognize they have to decrease in size. So what happens in a very simplified way if you're dealing with one of those directions? You know, if you're increasing, you're trying to use new facilities, you have to bring on board new people, you have to bring on board new processes. So how do you make sure that all of those activities are performed safely? How do you make sure the people are competent to work safely? Similarly, if you were trying to decrease in size, how do you decide which people you're going to lose? You know, on a health and safety basis, not from an operations basis. From health and safety, do you need to make sure that the people you're losing are the least effective when it comes to health and safety? So business risk, we're trying to make sure that companies understand that health and safety is today a key business risk. It affects your reputation, and if it affects your reputation, it affects your future ability to do business, and maybe even your future ability to survive. So we're trying to get people to understand why health and safety should be embedded in all your business thinking for your organization. What is a health and safety system? This is the official definition. A health and safety management system is a management system or part of a management system used to achieve the health and safety policy. That's the definition within the standard. Why do we say part of a system? If you remember yesterday, I was trying to say that historically companies ran their ISO 9000 systems separate from the way they actually manage their organization. So now we're saying you should bring everything together, and therefore health and safety is just one of the considerations you have to think about within your overall management system. So it could be just part of your management system. There's a note 2, which is quite interesting, which is what is the difference between OHS and OSH? For us, there's no difference, but it caused a fair degree of argument. Some organizations use OSH, and they wanted the standard to use that. But historically, we've used OHS to try and emphasize the health aspect, because that relates to the main causes of injuries and deaths from safety. When we look at how the standard is structured, the numbers in brackets refer to some of the clause numbers that we're going to go through soon. But we're trying to say that an organization works within a business environment, and that's this gray area, and we call that business environment the context of the organization. And from that context, you receive certain inputs that help you decide the direction for your business. And then within the system, you have leadership at the center, and then you go through fairly similar to the Deming cycle. You do your planning, your acting, your checking, your improving. Also, I said we follow this Annex L common structure. So all the stuff in red is clauses and text that are provided by the Annex L common structure. So if you're trying to use the 9001 quality standard or the ISO 14001 environmental standard, all of those red boxes are also going to be common to those other standards. We may have added little sentences to each of those boxes, but in the main they're common. Where we've added health and safety specific stuff, that's in the grey boxes. And particularly in clause 6, where we've added a lot of information, but I'll come back to that later on. So you can see that probably the Annex L structure is what, 60–70% of the standard. So this is why the work on the Annex L structure is quite critical for ISO and management systems. Some of the emerging differences with this former 18001 standard is there's much greater linkage to the strategic direction and the business processes of the organization. There's far greater emphasis on leadership and culture. We start talking about risks and opportunities. There's much greater emphasis on participation and consultation. We talk about something called documented information, which I will come to in detail later on. And we also talk about processes rather than activities. And we now have some explicit requirements for management of change, outsourcing, and contractors, which the former standard didn't really have. So that's a brief overview on 45001. Do you have any questions about what I've just been talking about? No? Okay. Because now we can then start otherwise on the individual clauses in detail. All right? So I need to show you the standard, and for that I need to get out of here, excuse me. So if I just, this is not projecting. No. Is anyone good at getting display settings to work properly? I always have problems with this computer. Sorry about this. Okay. No, I think I have it. Okay. Is it now displaying the standard? Yes, okay, solved. Okay, so if I look at the standard, it has a cover sheet, tells you the title, it tells you that it's copyright protected, there's a contents listing, it starts with a foreword, which is technical information from ISO about who produced it, patent rights, and things like that. So most people ignore the forewords. I think we did put a link there to, no, we didn't manage to put one there for the website, but there is one. Then we have an introduction. And the introduction is describing the purpose of the standard in very general terms. So that has stuff about the background, the aim of a health and safety system, some of what people consider would be the success factors. Sorry, question?
Just if I can remind everybody in Spanish where we put the standard, so in
Yep.
order they will be able to see it. Les mandamos una liga para una página para que puedan ustedes desplegar en sus teléfonos o en sus computadoras o tablets la norma. No se las podemos distribuir precisamente por lo que acaba de comentar Charles, porque tiene un copyright para la coordinación de nosotros. Entonces, solamente la pueden ver a través de la página a las cuales les dimos acceso, que es una página de Google Drive. Entonces tienen que hacer clic en ese link para poderla, por favor, desplegar. Y sí les pediríamos, por favor, que traigan sus laptops, sus tablets o sus teléfonos inteligentes, porque a partir de este momento van a necesitar la norma para el curso, ¿sí? Y les recordamos que todos los materiales también y la forma de trabajo de la coordinación es así, mediante ligas a través de los repositorios donde ponemos la información. Muy bien, so I
Okay.
just let them know that
They can
where
access it. Yep.
in the cloud we put
Okay.
the files.
Okay. At the moment, I'm just going through the standard very quickly to show you the structure. We're not going through it in detail. But yesterday I did say, please make sure you're able to access a copy of it today, because when we look at some of the clauses in detail, I'm going to ask you to actually read through the text before I start talking about it, because there's no point in me just projecting the text when you can read it, okay? So at the moment, I'm just saying that within the introduction, we had some background, we had a purpose on the aim of a health and safety system, some of what people consider are the success factors for a useful health and safety system, then a description of the plan, do, check, Deming cycle and how it's applied within the document. That's where we get the diagram comes up, showing the clauses, the sequence of clauses, and then a description of the contents of the document. So that's all very general information. We then come to the scope of the standard. And this is actually the official definition of the purpose of the standard. This says to users, it provides requirements. And then it tells you what the requirements are about. Again, I will go through this in a bit more detail in a moment, because there's some useful information there that we have to pick up. There's a clause called Normative References, and it says there are no normative references. Then there is a clause called Terms and Definitions. And then really, clause 4, after all these definitions, if I can find the start of clause 4, excuse me. Clause 4 is where we really start talking about health and safety, and where we start a discussion about the context of the organization, understanding the needs of interested parties, determining the scope of the system, and setting up the system. And then, if you will remember yesterday when I showed the common framework, I said there were clauses 4 to 10 which were defined in the common framework, the high-level clause numbers and titles. So we've got clauses 4 to 10 here. We've just looked at 4. I'm just going to skip right to the end, because what I want to show you I'm not quite there. Is that after the clauses 4 to 10, there is actually a guidance annex A. And the guidance annex A has been written to mirror the clause sequence of the clauses 1 to 10. So if you're looking for some help in applying some of the requirements from clauses 4 to 10, you can look to the Annex A, where there is some useful and helpful information. Okay? So the standard is the cover, some copyright information, a general foreword about what ISO and patent rights are all about, then an introduction, clauses 1 to 3, where we have the scope, normative references, terms and definitions, and then really the stuff you need to start looking at begins at clause 4. So let's go back to the presentation. Oops. So I want to start with clauses, the introduction to 1 to 3. The introduction, I briefly said, has 5 subclauses. The background, the aim of the health and safety system, success factors, the plan, do, check, act cycle, and contents of the document. There are some things worth picking up from that introduction. Things like an organization is responsible for the health and safety of workers and others who can be affected by its activities. It's not just workers, it's others. Who do we mean by others? We'll come to that. Okay? A health and safety management system is to provide a framework for managing health and safety risks and opportunities. And it enables an organization to manage its health and safety risks and improve its health and safety performance. Success factors. The success of a health and safety system depends on leadership, commitment, and participation from all levels and functions of the organization. That's a very bold statement. It says it can't just be the leaders, it's everyone. And the plan, do, check, act cycle is a concept, an iterative process used by organizations to achieve continual improvement. There's a little bit about what you can use the document for. Now, ISO is not allowed to write standards and say, because this standard exists, you have to get certified. Okay? So ISO doesn't define how a standard is used. It's up to you to decide what you want to do with it. So you're perfectly free to read the standard and say it's got some good ideas that I can apply, but I don't see the point in going forward all the way to certification. On the other hand, you could say, actually, I want to make a self-declaration. I want to say to other companies or potential customers, look, we do follow this standard. You know, and they can come along and audit you and check what you're doing. But you can say, we haven't gone for certification, but we do follow the standard. That's a self-declaration. And finally, it is written in such a way that you can, if you want, go for certification, which is sometimes called registration, by an independent certification body. But ISO has to follow what's called the neutrality principle. So it cannot direct you as to how you use a standard. So that's what this text is all about in Clause 5. When we look at the scope, in a number of places you will see the requirements talking about the intended outcomes of a health and safety system. And this is where these intended outcomes are defined. So it's continual improvement of health and safety performance, fulfillment of legal requirements and other requirements, and achievement of your health and safety objectives. Fairly straightforward. Now, in developing the standard, we had a big issue about legal requirements. ISO has a policy that says standards cannot demand legal compliance. And why does it have that policy? It says, well, the law is the law. You, either as an organization or an individual, are already required to comply with the law. So there's no point in us writing into a voluntarily used standard that you should comply with the law. That caused us a lot of problems because organizations like the International Labour Organization put so much emphasis on the laws and rules that they have developed that they said no company should get certified unless it can demonstrate it's legally compliant. But there's also a problem. When you audit companies, if I walk around this university, for example, it's a big organization. I'm sure that I could come across wires that are dangerously hanging that I could trip over. I managed to trip over them yesterday. I don't know how many of you noticed. That's a trip hazard. So by law, I have failed because I've created some sort of hazard. But a certification body, if it's auditing you, it has to make a decision. At what point does it say, the things I found are so bad that actually I need to report this organization? Or does it say, I've noted some very minor problems, like a small trip hazard, or someone's left a ladder with no warning around it, or the floor is slippery, or something like that. And it says, but actually that organization has managed all of its major risks properly, so I'm going to make some observations about these small things, but I'm still going to proceed to give it a certificate. So for some of the organizations to be saying, you must be fully legally compliant, well, with very big organizations, to have 100% legal compliance all of the time is very difficult. So it becomes slightly illogical. But we had lots of arguments about how to write requirements in the standard about legal compliance. It's also interesting to note that the standard that the certification bodies have to use, which is ISO IEC 17021 Part 1, there's a paragraph in there that says management systems audits are not legal compliance audits. Management systems auditors are not legal specialists. I mean, they may know about health and safety, they may know about problems with environment, or food safety, or other areas where there are legal requirements, but they're not there to tell you about them. Okay? And then someone asked me the question, they said, are legal requirements better? Because sometimes when you look at health and safety legislation, it's so old and out of date, and you go, really? You're wanting us to comply with that? Come on, why have you not revised it? Well, the politicians haven't had time to address it. They're dealing with much more interesting things. So sometimes you have to say, actually, why are you trying to force legal compliance on us when the health and safety legislation is not that good? Standards can be more flexible and more up to date. So that was quite an interesting discussion that we had during the development of the standard. And as we come to the text, you'll see how we have resolved it. Also, if you deal with some of the other standards, a standard was produced, ISO 19600, which talks about compliance obligations. And compliance obligations is both about legal requirements and the obligations that you establish as your own organization. So, you will have agreements with unions, for example, about ways of working. So when you put these two together, you create a set of compliance obligations that you have to work against. Now, interestingly, the ISO 14001 standard decided it preferred using that term, whereas 9000 and the 45001 standard decided actually they found it a little bit confusing and they would prefer to remain with talking about legal requirements. So you will see that we're not 100% consistent with 14001, but it means the same thing. So when we're continuing looking at the scope, the document enables an organization through its health and safety system to integrate other aspects of health and safety, such as worker wellness and well-being. The previous 18001 was very cautious about wellness and well-being and said, no, we don't want to address it. So there has been a slight change. And as I mentioned before, wellness and well-being is about trying to stop people smoking and take exercise and drink less, etc. So we're saying that the 45001 standard will help you define a core system, and yet you can open it up to using it for other things besides just strict health and occupational health and safety. The document doesn't address issues such as product safety, property damage, or environmental impacts beyond the risk to workers and other relevant interested parties. So we're saying 45001 is not intended to cover end users or consumers of products. Remember yesterday I gave you an example of a washing machine manufacturer that was being used for making drinks. But it's also about, within companies, if you're making products, are you talking about the safe use of those products? Not really. It's because you're not the user of those products unless you're doing some kind of test on them. So final product safety is achieved through good design. It's achieved through good instructions on how the product should be used. That's not really about occupational worker safety. That's about consumer protection and something called duty of care. So what is duty of care? Well, think about something like, I don't know, a circus. I've given the example there. Or Disney World, something like that. You have lots of people, lots of visitors coming to those places. Now, the circus owner or Disney World is responsible for the health and safety of those people. But that's a different obligation than it has to its workers. For its workers, it's strictly responsible for their occupational health and safety. For those other visitors, you have what is called a duty of care. I don't know how that's used in Spanish. Sorry.
No sé si tengamos I am not sure if we have an equivalent in Spanish, but I was thinking in our research laboratories, and I think this will apply for the students who came frequently to the laboratory to check some issues and so on. No? So it's different. You have to be, or as a lab, you have to be certain they are not going to be damaged being there or having a problem there.
Yep.
And as you said, it's different than the duty they have with their colleagues or the people who are working in the laboratory. So, because we have both as well.
Okay. So I think most countries have the same concept. I'm not sure what the labels are, but you can understand that what I'm trying to say is the standard is strictly about occupational health and safety for those workers directly employed by you or subcontracted by you, whereas visitors, I think I have more examples, airline, train passengers, supermarket customers, many instances you have visitors in your workplace that you have a responsibility for their safety, but it's not the same as duty of care. And again, what the 45001 standard is saying is that whilst it's strictly about occupational health and safety, there's no reason why you can't use the same management system for also addressing these other issues. But you would need to think separately about them. Normative references. Within standards, sometimes you say you should refer to another standard to do something. And in fact, in order to use the standard, you have to refer to that other standard. So I might say, for electrical cabling, our standard says the thickness of the plastic coating on the insulation must be so many millimeters, but please see this other standard as to how it's labeled. So if you're going to produce electrical cabling, you must produce it with this thickness of insulation, but you must label it according to the labeling standard. So we have a clause in all ISO standards, which is normative references, and that's where you list these other standards that are compulsory for you to reference. It's different from when you have a bibliography where you say, here are other standards or other documents which may be of interest. We have a problem in ISO that someone has identified that with certain standards, if you follow the normative references in one standard and then in the normative references in the other standards, you get a chain of about 50 standards you have to look at in order to use your original standard. That's a bit tricky. But for 45001, I'm pleased to say there are no normative references, so you don't have to refer to anything else to use it. Terms and definitions in Clause 3. This high-level structure provides 21 terms and definitions, and I think in total, within 45001, we've got 37 terms and definitions. So we've added some additional ones. One of the things we found when writing the high-level structure was actually ISO has 397 different definitions of organization, and it had 225 different definitions of management system. That's not very good if you're claiming to be a standards body trying to standardize management systems. How is an organization different for an environmental system from a health and safety system? It isn't really. So one of the useful aspects of this common framework is we finally merge these concepts. When I look at the previous 18,000 standard and when I look at what is in the new 45,000 standard, there have been some changes with some of the terms, such as organization, interested party, and workplace. But we've also included quite a few new terms, like worker, quite interestingly, outsourcing, processes, documented information. I could force you to look at the Clause 3 on definitions, but I don't think that would be particularly productive. So I'm going to skip over quite a lot of that. We'll come back to it, or come back to individual points as we need to. The first one of which is workers. This was a huge row in writing the standard. Some of the organizations participating, the trades unions, the International Labour Organization, feel very, very strongly that health and safety is about protecting what I would call blue-collar workers, people on the shop floor. They don't really care so much about managerial level workers. They take the approach that managers are completely responsible for health and safety, that shop floor blue-collar workers are perfect little angels who only ever have accidents because the managers make mistakes. So they wanted the purpose of the standard to be about workers. And it took us a while to convince them that actually if you're dealing with a health and safety system, it's about everyone who works in the organization. Absolutely everyone. You can have a new director come onto your site tomorrow and he can have an accident. Isn't the company or the organization just as responsible for his health and safety as it is for the blue-collar workers? So they conceded that, but they insisted that we use the term worker to reference anyone within the organization. That's fine, but when you look at the definition of worker, it now also includes contractors. Okay, I'll come back to that in a minute. But it also makes it quite difficult when they wanted to start talking about management worker joint consultative committees. How can you have a management now it's a worker-worker consultative committee because you've defined everyone as a worker. So there are points in the standard where the logic is a little bit strange because of the adoption of this definition of worker. So we'll see that later on. The other issue with the standard, I said in the scope, we said it applies to people who may be affected by your company, your organization, and its operations. This is quite interesting when you talk about neighbors. So if you have a neighbor, or if you're talking about the local town or something like that, and you have a big explosion on your site, and you start pouring out toxic gases, in Europe, that would be treated as a health and safety issue. In the USA, that would be treated as an environmental issue. So we had, when we were originally writing the 18001 standard, to find a way that would accommodate both the European and the American approaches to this issue. And so what we have in respect of people like neighbors is we talk about the system should take account of potential impacts that you may have on your neighbors and the surroundings, but also what potential impacts could your neighbors have on you. So if you're working in a very dangerous area, chemical laboratories, for example, if there's an explosion in one laboratory, does it affect an adjacent laboratory? What systems have you put in place to prevent a fire from one spreading to the other? Or noxious fumes spreading to the other? Or if you're working in a big chemical factory, do you have shared firefighting responses or something like that? So we've tried to overcome issues about neighbors in that respect. Visitors and customers, they're potentially duty of care issues that we were talking about a moment ago, rather than directly the focus of occupational health and safety. There's a definition of health within the standard, but we had quite a lot of arguments about the definition of ill health. We know many organizations are very good at dealing with the trips and spills and mechanical safety issues. How good are they really about dealing with health issues? We're talking, look at today, there is this coronavirus that's occurring in China. Look at the measures that the Chinese state has taken to prevent the virus spreading. But I can remember when I first joined my organization, I had a private office. I could shut the door. Now I work in an open plan office with about 60 people in it. If someone at the back sneezes on Monday, by Friday, maybe I have a cold. Now, do organizations actually think about disease transmission in a simple workplace? I don't think they really do. So maybe it's something that with potential viruses like coronavirus that we're going to have to give more attention to in the future. But there was quite a lot of argument about including references on occupational diseases. Because if you go back to that list of occupational diseases I gave you, some of the things like cancers, asthma, which are on that list, I mean, really are those directly related to the work situation? Or is it that the person who may have been hurt or harmed with those diseases had an underlying or even a genetic condition that made them more susceptible to those diseases? We don't know. It's a very difficult one to answer. So, should companies be directly responsible for someone who has an underlying condition, is the question. Because this can affect the insurance rates they have to pay. So there were a lot of industry people in the committee who really didn't want us accepting occupational diseases as part of the definition of ill health. But after a lot of discussion, it was decided to accept it. So if you look at the definition of ill health, you will see that there is a note saying that it includes occupational diseases. And that's really what I've been discussing there. Sorry, I got ahead of myself. So let's look at review of the introduction scope. That was the end of that one. Clause 4. Clause 4 is something called the context of the organization. I've talked about a little bit about the business environment. Some of you, I think, are familiar what the context is. But why do we start with the context? We'll come to that in a minute. But the 4 clauses within this main clause heading are understanding the organization, understanding the needs and expectations of interested parties, and then the 45,000 authors, they added workers and other interested parties. They wanted to emphasize that workers were the key stakeholders. By the way, the word interested parties is interchangeable with the word stakeholders. That's a defined term. Determining the scope of the system and establishing a health and safety system. So this is actually the requirement from the standard about understanding the organization in its context. It shall determine the external and internal issues that are relevant to its purpose and affect its ability to achieve the intended outcomes of its health and safety management system. So what can you think of as being potential external and internal issues? I'll come back to that again in a minute. But why did we start from this context area? In the past, standards like 18,000 and standards like 14,000, the first block in their diagram was policy. Top management shall establish a policy. And the question is, where does that policy come from? You know, it doesn't come out of thin air. And how do you make sure that it aligns with its strategic direction? You really need to know what is going on in the world. And you need to be thinking, perhaps, in terms of sustainability. You know, what is happening with economic growth? What's happening with social equity? What's happening with environmental integrity? Where do you put your health and safety on this kind of map? So, Clause 4.2 was about understanding the needs and expectations of workers and other interested parties. As I said, interested parties could be stakeholders, but who are the typical interested parties? So you have the owners and the shareholders, you have organizations that provide financing, banks and bond companies, suppliers and contractors to the organization, people who work for the organization, the customers of the organization, regulatory bodies, trades unions, or other non-governmental organizations like professional health and safety associations. So we said in clause 4.2, you're supposed to assess the needs and expectations of these interested parties. So what do you think these kinds of people are going to be demanding in terms of health and safety from your organization? So, we're going to do another group exercise. Here are the questions I want you to think about. What sorts of issues from the clause 4.1 affect your organization? And what inputs should you use when trying to determine your context? Because the standard doesn't define where those inputs come from. Also, it doesn't define who should be dealing with determining the context, and when and how frequently. So I'd like you to think about that as well. And also, there's no requirement in 4.1 for documenting the results of your determination of the context. Why do you think that is? So we now have, it's now about 12:30. There will be a coffee break at 1 o'clock. So please can you take the time between now and 1 o'clock to think about these issues, and then when we come back after the coffee break, we'll report on these and we'll discuss them, okay? So please can you go into your teams again and start thinking about these 4 questions. Okay. So we're ready for coffee?
Exacto.
Yeah?
Vamos a hacer el break ahora. Bueno, los que quieran salir, los que no, no hay problema. Pero les recomiendo salir porque la doctora Elba nos hizo el favor de traer churros. Entonces, muchas gracias, doctora.
Ava, thank you very much for the churros. So about 20 minutes, please. We see you back here. Thank you. So, are we ready to restart? Yes? Where's the microphone gone? Which group would like to answer the first question first? This group? This group here? Yes, of course you would like to. So answering the first question, please.
Okay, for the first question, we think in some issues. For example, design of the building, infrastructure. What was the vision of the project of the building, or
Okay.
thinking in the activities?
Mhm.
One point that we think is important, for example, in the UNAM, the buildings are very old.
Yep.
Then the infrastructure, like energy supplies, electric supplies, or different walls don't correspond that the actual needs,
Yep.
then now that is a problem.
Okay.
Yeah. And another point is the people. The people in our workplaces is not interested in the safe and health topics.
Okay.
In general, in our institutes and faculties,
Yep.
that is a topic.
But do they act unsafely or they are just not interested?
Not interested.
Okay. But generally they act safely.
Yes.
Generally? Okay. Okay, thank you. Very useful. Okay, another group over here this time. Should we go? I'll take it. You're going to say this
Yes.
time. Thank you. Okay.
Well, for the first question, well, I am a different opinion than the professor before, because it's a difference between the different faculties and the institutes.
Yep.
In some schools, we have a responsibility, and we give some responsibilities to the students and the professors about the safety and health.
Okay.
Yes, that is the first. In the question, what sorts of issues affect your organization? Well, we were talking about the lack of commitment of workers and the students to
Okay.
apply all the rules all the time. That is the first. The second is the training for emergencies that all the students should have all the time, and the maintenance of the installations and the works, the equipments and all the other buildings that we have. For the second, what inputs should you use when determining the context and how can you acquire them? Well, we were talking about the visits to the workplaces. These visits provide information that is used to generate a report with specific recommendations for the authorities and for the responsible people of the laboratories that should give the response to all the problems that we detected.
Okay, let's stop there. I just want the answers to the first question for the moment, okay? Yep, okay. Yep. So can we go across over here? Over there? Yeah. Ah. It's you again, Rafa? Yes? Okay.
Thanks, Charles. In this case, we talk about a chemical laboratory for educational purpose. And we have certain issues of storage of chemical and hazard materials.
Okay.
The infrastructure of the laboratory per se, because we don't have the enough maintenance of the installations. We also agree that. And the accommodation of the laboratory. Sometimes the temperature inside or the humidity that is needed, we don't have that kind of things.
Okay.
And safety rules for working inside the laboratory. We don't have all the safety rules of that.
Okay. So I'm getting worried that I shouldn't be here at UNAM. You don't have rules. People don't follow the rules. Where is the emergency exit? It's this direction? I should leave now?
Yeah.
Okay.
Some kind of things of that.
Okay. We have this team here. So just on the first question. Okay.
In our team, for the question number 1, we defined first resistance to change,
Yep.
lack of awareness, and bad practices, lack of knowledge of the normativity, and also the normativity sometimes are complex, are not clear here in Mexico, or are obsolete. Lack of supervision also, and some elements of security that we have, but we most of the time we don't use.
Okay.
For the question number 2.
No, just question number
Just
1.
one?
Yeah.
That's one.
Okay. Any other group want to say something about question 1? There's 2 more. Okay.
I once say, talk about the health, mental health.
Okay.
Because it's one point that is very important for the organizations,
Yep.
and is a point that nobody talk about it.
Okay.
Is health, mental health in scientific area is like a punto débil, a weak point in
Yeah.
the people.
But surely, historically, with academics, you go, either he's a genius or he's crazy.
Yes.
So where is the separation point?
And today
No?
is a topic very important because the consequences that not attend this topic,
Yep.
we can see almost every day.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, we have one more group. 2 more.
For in our group, analysis our company and the source of issues affect our organization is safety, security equipment, schedules, sickness, and natural disasters.
Okay, thank you. Very good. And there's one more right at the back there. Yep.
We think about this issue. We consider lack of leadership from our authorities. Some of them don't do the right communication for all the people. So we need a clear definition of responsibilities, self-care culture, and kind of obligatority or in the protocols. We were discussing about our own Mexican culture. We think Mexicans are kind of God's people chosen, and we are never going to have any trouble because we are we. No, we don't know if this can happen in other countries, but here is very, very, very common. And we think about lack of control and knowledge of risk and overwork, labor in and without people. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. You've all made very good points. Listening to you, one of the things I've noted is that most of the points you've raised are internal issues. Very few of you have made comments about external issues. The lady here, you made one comment about environmental disasters. Okay, that's an external issue. But what about things like you had a change of government? The funding for academic institutes was changed. The level went down. Does that mean you have lesser ability to recruit staff? You know, or environmental conditions, or less investment for new infrastructure. You said the infrastructure is not working. What about most of your laboratories use reference materials in some shape or form? What happens if a major supplier goes bankrupt and is unable to provide you with those kind of materials? You know, how does that affect your ability to perform? What about there might be new legislation coming? How do you prepare yourself to meet this new legislation? We talked, I think someone said, about no contact from your boss at weekends. How is that going to affect your performance? So you were very good, I think, on the internal issues, but context is also about how do you reach out and understand what may be happening in the wider world that's going to impact the way you operate in the future. So you need to think a little bit more about those. But otherwise, very good points raised. Thank you. Okay, so should we try taking the next two questions? What input should you use? And who should deal with determining the context and when and how frequently? So again, should we listen? Who's going to start us on this issue? Who has the microphone currently? Okay, you can start us there again, please. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah.
We expect, in this point, 0 accidents, improve productivity, diminish the absenteeism, security protocols, maintenance protocols, accessibility in communications, and a serious program of capacitation in our laborers.
Okay. But on the next question, who should deal with determining the context? Did you have ideas for that?
Obviously, there is needed a leadership in high direction, but we must give all the community the responsibility. The responsibility is personal, and everyone must work for his own safety and health.
Okay, thank you. Next group.
In our case, we discuss about the safety data sheet of the chemicals that we are using and the rules of storage of this kind of material. But also, most of the information is about us instead of the surroundings. That's the main problem. But the information is possible to acquire without problem with this information. In the case, we see two different levels of who participate in this. The people of the laboratory, the first, but also the managers of the building that is this laboratory. We have to cooperate in these two levels. And well, we start with information, but I don't know how to say simulacrum, the response of risk. Something like that. When you put in your plan in operation, We have to discuss if this is in accordance with that we need, or we need to change the rules for that operation.
Okay, thank you. Next group. Okay.
For question number 2, we define meetings with the top management of the organization and with the personnel of the organization.
Okay.
Surveys
Mhm.
with either with the personnel of the organization or the clients of the organizations could be a good input. Internal and external audits and supervisions. That
Okay.
would be for number 2. And for number 3,
Yep.
we said that this could be once in a year,
Mhm.
or if there's an unplanned change or a relevant change in the organization or in the context, or either a natural catastrophe,
Okay.
could be important to determine against the context.
Thank you very much. Okay, so we have a couple more groups to give us answers. Yes? Who's volunteering?
Well, for the question 2, we talk about the different committees of hygiene,
Yeah.
hygiene and security in different institutes. There are 2 or 3 committees, and the people that integrate that committees are training in different topics about that.
Okay.
Then we think these people can help in this in integrated context.
Okay.
And for 3, well, the leader is very important,
Mhm.
and use service also for the people that day by day use the facilities.
Okay. Thank you. Anyone else? No? Okay, one more.
Well, in our case, we analyzed the information that we obtained before, and we determined that for us, we need a little of history about the services that we provide.
Okay.
We can suppose some kind of events, but if you don't have a history about the success or no of the activities, it's difficult to determine if you will have a risk in some kind of activities. So I think that it's important that you analyze, as you explained us, the internal and the external environment that you will have, and based on that, you might determine some kind of activities and the risk of them.
Okay. Thank you. Okay. Anyone else? No. All right. So when you read the requirement in the standard, actually it doesn't define the answers to questions 2 and 3. And really I was asking the question for number 2 was more about external issues. The answers you've given me again generally about internal processes, and they're very good answers. But again, how do you make sure that you're aware of external changes that could have an impact on you? So I gave the example of a supplier of reference materials going bankrupt. How do you predict that that's going to happen? How do you get some kind of market intelligence? Or changes in legislation relating to labor functions? How do you keep yourself aware of these things? Now, sometimes it can be very senior managers, they read the papers, they go to meetings with other corporate directors, and they get this kind of information informally. But also you have people going out at much lower levels, maybe salespeople, maybe purchasing managers, they get information as well. They hear things. So my question is, what are the systems you use to bring all of this information together so that the people who are going to define your policies and objectives in the future have a clear picture of what might be happening to your organization? So the internal is good, but please think also about how do you get the external information. In terms of the frequency, I think you gave a very good answer. You know, you should regularly say once a year minimum we will have some kind of strategic review of our contacts. But then if natural disasters or changing circumstances happen, we should again review the context and see how that's changed. So I think that's a very useful answer. There's no fixed prescribed frequency. I would say, though, that if you're going to be certified, the certification process, if you're not familiar with it, certification starts with a big audit, and they audit every requirement from the standard. After that, for 3 years, they conduct audits every 6 months. And they will look at certain aspects at these 6 monthly audits. They won't audit the whole system. But perhaps you need to show some evidence of conducting these activities within the 6-month period if you are to maintain your certification. Okay? And then at the end of 3 years of doing these 6 monthly audits, they do a full audit once again. That's the defined process for certification at the moment. So maybe once a year is not quite enough. Maybe we should say twice a year so that when the auditors come, if they decide to audit your examination of context, you have evidence of having done that. Okay, so question 4. Why is there no requirement to document it? Would anyone like to give an answer? No? You don't know why. Okay. I think it's because the standard has to be applicable to any size of organization, from very small ones to very big ones. Now, sometimes during the context review, the organization will be thinking, we have to stop doing this. You know, maybe we have to close down a factory, a site, a laboratory, an institute. We are going to have to let people go. You perhaps don't want that to become public knowledge. You want to plan the processes for that closure. This is why we link context to strategic direction. So maybe in small businesses, the chief executive of a company of 10 people, he has all of this in his mind. He doesn't need it written down. So perhaps that is why the standard doesn't require it, because it could be very sensitive information, or it could be the organization is so small that the directors manage to maintain that information without records. I don't know. Currently, this common framework is being reviewed, and people are asking the question, should we demand that the context be documented? They haven't made the decision yet. But I think that's the reason why historically there was no requirement for the context to be documented. Okay? Please.
I understand the explanation, but I think that it's important to determine. Obviously, the standard doesn't require a document in which you write the results of the context of the analysis. But that doesn't mean that you don't have to do that analysis. So,
No, you have to do the analysis.
So,
Yeah.
which will be the enough evidence to show that you have an analysis about the context.
Okay, this is an interesting question. When you go to a court, do you have to provide documented evidence for everything? No. You get evidence by questioning people. So an auditor can be expected to question people. So if I was going to a small business and there is the chief executive, I say, how have you done the context analysis? And if he says to me, look, I'm reading the papers, I'm in touch with my suppliers, I'm going to the Confederation of Managers meetings once a month, I'm getting intelligence that way, then he would have convinced me by his verbal argument that he had done the context analysis. Okay? So you have to be very careful that getting evidence
Enough information.
is not necessarily it has to be written down.
Yeah.
In fact, it's one of my personal complaints about the standards we've seen, 9,000, 14,000, and 45,000. When the common framework was written, there were very few requirements for documented information. And then when you see what the committees have done, is they have added for almost every clause, you must have documented information, you must have documented information. And this has turned the standards in a way from being management documents to being auditing documents, because they're more concerned about providing the evidence for auditors than about this is how you should manage. So I personally am slightly concerned about the amount of requirements, but I'm seeing more and more demands for documented context and things like that. So we'll see. When this review finishes next year, we'll see what's in the new framework. Okay? But thank you for your question. So, none of you cheated, which was a bit unfortunate, because I said to you there's an Annex A, and the Annex A gives lots of examples of external context issues, and it also gives lots of examples of internal context issues. Now, let's look external. There may be changes in political, legal, financial, technological things. There may be new health and safety ways of doing things. Introduction of new suppliers, contractors, partners, trends relevant to your industry or sector having an impact on your organization, relationships and perceptions and values of external interested parties. I mean, for health and safety, this is particularly what does your regulator think about your operations, and how often do they come and visit to check that you're doing things properly, or changes to any of the above. And for internal, this is more about sort of governance, organizational structure, accountability. Someone at the back said you should define very clearly who's responsible for what. Policies, objectives, and strategies are in place to achieve them. Compatibilities in terms of resources, knowledge, and competence. Information systems. The introduction of new products and services. The relationships and perceptions and values of workers, culture, standards, guidelines, and models that you might be using. So these are just examples, but they were in the guidance annex. One thing we note when we talk to a lot of organizations and we say, what is your context? We get blank stares coming back. I mean, this is very big commercial organizations I've been to discuss this issue with. So what we've suggested to them is think about the 4.2 requirement, your list of stakeholders or interested parties, and then against each one of those, write down what you think their main concerns are. Because that's then a way of thinking about issues. But once you've dealt with your interested parties, then think about wider things, like business continuity issues. You mentioned natural effects. You know, what happens if there's an earthquake? What happens if there's flooding? And not necessarily here, but in a remote part of the world. So, for example, if you deal with computers, many years ago, I think Taiwan had very bad flooding, and it was not possible to get motherboards for computers. Now, you might not be a computer manufacturer, but if your computer breaks and you need it for your critical research, and it's not possible to get a motherboard, what are you going to do? So having an awareness of what's happening around the world is actually important in determining your context. But as a way of starting, think about the interested parties and their immediate needs. Okay? But I was thinking of a few points for other examples not included in the lists given in Annex A. What about how do you create and sustain a positive culture within your organization? You've mentioned here that, you know, you have a culture where there are some rules, yet students and perhaps faculty don't always abide by them. How could you change that culture? What would it take for you to change it? Is it just the directors of the institutes have to start being much more severe when they hear about problems? Or is it that the reporting systems are not even in place to report that you're breaching the rules? How would you go about changing that culture? It's a very difficult issue. New technologies that are less hazardous, more visible engagement with health and safety professional associations and external events. You talked about there are coordination activities between the different institutes, which is good. For me, that's some form of benchmarking between what is happening in institutes and knowledge sharing. But could you extend that to what happens at different universities? You know, is that possible? So when should the context be evaluated? Well, the clause about management review that we're going to come to later does talk about reviewing the changes in internal and external issues. So that's about the only place in the standard where it says some sort of re-evaluation of context should be conducted. And who deals with management review? It says top management. So the standard is saying really setting the context is a top management issue. Because from the top management, they will determine the actions that need to be taken to improve your health and safety situation. So that, I think, is enough on the first two parts of context. The next part of the context is about where are you going to apply your management system? Is it to the whole of your organization, or are you allowed to apply it to just part of your organization? This causes a lot of difficulty, particularly when companies are going for certification. They say, you know, I'm a global multinational company. Do I have to get the whole company certified in one go? Or can I start with the division in Mexico, then the division in the UK and France and Germany, and slowly build up? Well, it's really anywhere where you can define that there is total managerial control over a specific unit can be identified as suitable for its own system. Now, there will always be a relationship between that unit and the global parent organization. So how do you have your different institutes, how do you relate to the top controlling board of the university? You know, maybe you would want to start, we will put health and safety in the Institute of Nuclear Physics. And then we will see how that goes, and then we will move it to the Institute for Chemistry, Biology, or whatever, and eventually we will report at the top level how successful it's been, the lessons we've learned, the improvement in health and safety. So what you can do is you can create a global health and safety system, but you can say, for the purposes of certification, we are going to limit it to a certain division. That is acceptable for the standard, okay? But one of the things it did lead to was a lot of discussion about what do we mean by workplace. So historically, when we talked about health and safety, we would think of a specific physical site. We would say, you know, here is a factory with the gate around it, and we're only responsible for health and safety within that factory, or a mine, or some big office block. And that was quite easy to control. But today, people are working all over the place. You know, I'm here today in Mexico. What does my boss know about my health and safety situation? He's not stood next to me. How can he say he's directly responsible for my health and safety? How do you deal with that situation? How do you deal with people who are doing deliveries or doing logistics of some kind? So ISO 45001 recognizes that some organizations will have little control in certain circumstances, and you have to think of ways of trying to improve that control or improve that worker's situation. The last clause in Clause 4 is about the health and safety system shall be established, implemented, maintained, and continually improved, and the organization has to set up the system, including the processes needed and their interactions. The reason that this clause was written was to try and avoid repeating this statement in every other clause in the standard. Unfortunately, the drafters got carried away. So you will see that most of the requirements clauses start with the organization shall establish, implement a process for doing a context analysis, doing risk analysis. They didn't realize that in terms of good drafting, this clause removed the need to do that. We need to educate the committees a little bit more, is the result of that discussion. Okay? But I'm now going to make you do another exercise. So, how can you ensure the safety of people working remotely? I've described the problem to you, but can you think of solutions? How do you, as a university, ensure when you send people to go and lecture abroad or attend conferences somewhere else, how do you ensure their safety? And I've given an example of, for example, what happens if you arrive at a hotel in a strange city and you find out you're in a very dangerous area and the hotel's not very good. How do you deal with that? The reason I give that example is because usually a hotel, the company will have made some kind of booking, it will have paid some money. So if you're going to change, it's going to cost the company money. And some companies are very resistant to letting employees spend extra money. So can you spend a few minutes thinking about that? And also, what specific action would you have to take to comply with Clause 4.4? So again, I'm going to give you about half an hour to discuss this item in your groups again, and then we'll take feedback on it. Okay? So please start. Okay. I can see there's been a lot of interesting discussions on this. So I'm going to ask you to report back now. I'm going to cut a few minutes off. All right. Okay, so on the first question, I'm going to separate it into various parts.
Okay.
So, what would you do about people working from home? How do you ensure the safety of people working from home?
Well, we discussed that in this case, our example is from the chemical laboratory. We don't have that possibility to work remotely. That's,
Okay.
we don't discuss about that.
Okay, so you're not answering question one. Okay, good.
In our case, we
Yeah.
working with computer many times,
Yeah.
and it's very common that we work in house
Yes.
or remotely. Then we think that the solution is the organization shall evaluate the environment and civil protection measure, infrastructure, and good practice in our home office.
Okay.
For example, the chair
Yeah.
were working, or how many times we use, we stay from the computer.
Can I ask a question? Within your work environment here, in your office here,
Yeah.
do you have assessments of how you sit, how you type, how far the computer screen is away? Are you required to complete assessments for that?
In this place?
Yeah.
Yes, I think is adecuado,
It's required?
is adequate because,
Okay.
well, in my case, I working for the university in Cuernavaca.
Okay.
And in Mexico City, university is the same organism. Then if something happening me here,
Yep.
my angels
Yep.
could me.
Okay. Okay, I'll give the example of my own company. So on a regular basis, I am required to do a self-assessment of my seating, my chair, my monitor for my laptop, because we plug in and we have big screen monitors. I'm required to go for eyesight tests. So if my eyesight is deteriorating because of computer use, the company provides free spectacles to use the computer. Now that's easily controllable within the office environment, and occasionally when the health and safety auditors come around, they will ask people, how do you sit? How do you perform? Have you had your eyes tested? Things like that. Actually, it's similar for people who work from home. We have a self-assessment process that says, do you create an environment at home where you're sitting up properly, you're typing properly so you don't get repetitive strain injury, that the monitor is properly set up for you. What we have is a situation where we have some people who are defined as working from home full-time, where we expect them to have actually an office-type environment, and perhaps even a dedicated room as an office, and where we will pay for telephones and internet and things like that. And we have other people who we say it's optional whether you work from home if it becomes more convenient for you, where we don't make such stringent requirements for the equipment and the way they establish their environment, but we still ask them to do a self-assessment. And occasionally, the auditors will say, we've looked at the list of people who are voluntarily working from home, we're going to go and visit one. We're going to see that actually people are not just going, this is a bureaucratic exercise, we'll just tick all the boxes. And the threat that the auditors might come and visit you is enough to make most people actually behave properly. So that's one way of controlling the working from home situation. Okay, so thank you for your answers. Very good. Okay, let's take the other one, working remotely. That's not working from home, that's working somewhere completely different. I gave the example of me being here. How do people check that I'm okay while I'm here? You send people away. How does the university check on your safety before sending people away? Okay, at the back there. Microphone, please. I will take it.
In our case, usually scientists or technicians have to request a permit to leave. And with that, you can usually go ahead and do all the process for a security.
Yep.
You have an insurance that covers yourself, your person, your health, and whatever happens on the way and where you're working. This is the way it's handled here at the university. For that, you really need to have at least the notification 3 days in advance so that you can request the process of the insurance. And then the university usually transfers the decision to the person at which hotel they want to stay. Usually it's not the university that defines the hotel you're going to stay.
Okay.
And the area of the city where you're traveling to, where you're going to stay. It's a decision taken by the person, according to the person's decision.
Okay.
I wanted to ask an additional thing about home office. We were discussing whether we found 3 different options for security, which is cybernetic security, because you will be handling data from the university.
Yeah.
Physical security, which is the infrastructure that you are using to work, and then structural, and then the health security, because people sitting too long time at their home and in a closed environment usually are exposed as well to other concentrations of gases or in the environment.
Okay,
And
so
that is put in contrast to the risk that you potentially can find when you travel to your work.
yes. Again, you have to trust people to a certain extent. So the self-evaluation process should be saying, what is your physical environment? What is your security? Do you take breaks properly so that you go out into get fresh air, come back in? I mean, when we moved from individual offices to open plan offices, the biggest argument is about the temperature control. Some people want the window wide open, even in the middle of winter when it's -1. Other people in summer want the heating at maximum because they want 40 centigrade. This drives us nuts. Really, really drives us nuts. And so the main argument between colleagues has been about temperature, not seating, not computing use, etc.
Especially at the coast when we have humidity and there is heat.
Yep. So I think to answer most of your questions, it's down to the self-evaluation process and doing some sort of audit sampling of what people are saying on that self-evaluation. But in terms of traveling, so for example, I travel frequently. About once a month I have to go somewhere strange. My company has, from the insurers, risk ratings for each country. So certain countries, they say, absolutely you cannot go to. And I go, but I was on holiday in Iran last week. I want to go back there. It's a lovely place. Mexico was on the risk list for a while. So I had a special process to come here. So first of all, there's a country risk rating. Then they say with our travel agent, you know about airlines, how risky are the airlines? Hotels, we're again supposed to discuss with the travel agency company the risks associated with hotels. But sometimes it's very difficult. You know, I plan big committee meetings, maybe 200 or 300 people. You're very lucky to get someone to offer to host the meeting. In one situation, a big committee, the venue was in the middle of the red light district of their capital city. What would we be supposed to do? Well, we said to the delegates, you need to be aware of this, perhaps traveling with partners or making partnership arrangements to go from there to your hotel is a good idea. But really, I think where it comes down to for traveling or the hotel question I asked is about policies. So you should set policies about risk assessment before people travel. And then the hotel question is about empowerment. You know, have you empowered someone to say, this area is not safe, I need to change? You know, they must have the authority to go and purchase a different hotel. That's not an excuse to say, I will never stay in a 3-star hotel. You know, I'm only ever going to stay in 5-star ones. You must be able to justify your decision. Maybe take some photos or something like that. But it also leads to a question about the competence of the person. Can that person competently assess the risk of the area that they're staying in? So there are a number of factors there, but it starts with organizations setting good travel policies that require risk assessments at certain levels and then agree that employees are empowered and competent at different levels to make decisions. Okay? So I think that's mainly question 1. What about question 2? What specific action are you required to take under clause 4.4? Yep. So 4.4, that's the requirement. Does anyone have an answer what specific action you're supposed to take? There's one at the back, yeah.
Yeah, we have here at the university, we consider us very, very lucky because we have a hospital for ourselves. We have in every institution we have infirmaries, we have doctors for us, we have established programs for securities. So we have firefighters inside the university, and those actions are clearly very valuable for all our community.
Okay.
And we have strong programs of training like this.
Okay.
That other universities or other organizations are not able to afford, for example.
Yep. Okay.
And in each organization here we have protocols for security. We have a coordinator for civil protection and security. We have programs for handle all our RBPIs and chemical waste.
Yep.
And those is a great opportunity here.
Okay, thank you very much. Does anyone else have a comment about 4.4? No? Okay. So what you said is fantastic. I love hearing all of that. But actually, if you read that text, there is no specific action you have to take. It just says, you shall create a system. And the reason I wanted to highlight this is there are a number of clauses in the standard where they're making very generic statements like this, but you cannot identify a specific action that you must take. This just says you must have a system. Fantastic. We all understand the purpose of the standard is you must have a system. So there are some clauses in the standard where there is no specific requirement. And we're going to come across those as we go through. Okay? So it's not all that difficult. Okay, I'm going to start clause 5, which is on leadership. In the generic framework, this Annex L framework, it was just called leadership, but then because of health and safety reasons, we put and worker participation. And there are 4 subclauses about leadership and commitment, policy, organizational roles, and then we added an additional one for 45,000 about consultation and participation of workers. Now, why did we start talking about leadership? If you look at any management theory, it says unless there's commitment of leaders, then the management initiative will fail. You know, it has to be a constant and visible demonstration of your commitment if the system is to succeed. If it's just the rector says, I want to improve health and safety in 2021, but by 2022 he's onto something completely different, and his attention is no longer there, and he's no longer asking questions, you know, is our health and safety improving? People will react by saying, oh, it was just his initiative for that year, now we can forget about it. We can go back to behaving badly like we used to beforehand. So we wanted to emphasize in the standard the issue of leadership. But it's very difficult to write objectively accessible requirements for leadership. If you do a Google search on what are the good criteria of good leadership, you find things like leaders are good at having a vision and for setting a direction, for selecting people, for delegating authority, for creating teams, for motivating people. All of these factors we talked about yesterday. But there are a couple of other factors you find. Good leaders are narcissistic. They're psychopathic. Why? Because they have this vision. They want to achieve that vision. So what drives them to achieve it? It's their narcissism and their psychopathy that does it, perhaps. I don't know. But we can't write those kind of criteria into a standard. You know, only employ psychopaths as your CEOs. Actually, an evaluation of the top 100 companies in the UK showed that 70% are slightly psychopathic. But that's a different issue. So traditionally, in the standards, what we've said is leaders demonstrate their commitment by writing a policy and by defining objectives and communicating those. But we wanted to go a little bit further. And what you see now in the common framework is a whole series of bullets about what they should be doing. And some of them are fairly straightforward about communicating the importance of management, ensuring the health and safety system achieves its intended outcomes. But then you see other strange things, directing and supporting persons to contributing to the success of the system, or supporting management to demonstrate their leadership. By this they mean supporting the line managers to show their leadership. Developing, leading, and promoting a health and safety culture. These are unusual things. These are the new requirements that we're bringing in to try and say management is about good leadership and that good leadership being promulgated throughout the organization. So there are some new things there. One of the things that 5.1 also requires is compatibility of policy and objectives with the strategic direction of the organization. So once again, we're saying, from your context, you have decided a strategy for your organization, make sure your policy and objectives is compatible. Culture. 5.1J is the first reference to culture. Now, in the annex, we've tried to describe culture. We haven't given a definition for culture of what we mean. And it's, culture that supports a health and safety management system is largely determined by top management and is the product of individual and group values, attitudes, managerial practices, perceptions, competencies, patterns of activities that determine the commitment to and the style and proficiency of its health and safety system. So really the personalities of the people at the top really drive how people react underneath. What does that say to you in terms of leadership and in terms of defining the culture of the organization? If you have a poor safety culture, you have a lot of accidents, how do you change it? I did ask the question earlier this morning about how do you create a positive culture? Is it that you have to change the leadership? Is it that you need to look at your recruitment policies or your policies for appointing people to certain positions more carefully? Because you need them to be able to communicate and deal with people better. It's a very difficult issue. But there are a little bit more about culture, origins of a safety culture. The Confederation of British Industry describes it as the mix of shared values, attitudes, and patterns of behavior that give organizations its particular characteristic. So while an organization's policies and procedures may look well considered, they may not be fit for purpose. Part of the problem. It's vital that the perceptions and beliefs of workers are considered and that they commit to the policies and procedures. So how are you going to get people to actually follow the rules? Again, it emphasizes the importance of leadership and the commitment of the chief executive or the highest person. There needs to be an executive role for line managers. If line managers see things going wrong, they need to have the authority to make changes. They cannot wait always for the top managers to give approval for action. Competence and involvement of employees. Again, unless the employees are involved in defining what is safe and safe ways of working, will they participate? Will they follow the rules? But how do they get the competence to know what is correct? Does that mean you have to have some sort of training? Or do you just employ people who are competent? What about communications? We talked about transparency earlier. If people don't trust the communications they're receiving, then how will they trust the commitment of the leaders? How will they trust the system? There needs to be openness and fairness. demonstration of care and concern for all of those affected by the business. Does that happen? I mean, I mentioned most organizations are hierarchical. Okay, some try some form of matrix management, but most organizations are hierarchical in nature. Do you ever see the senior managers walking around talking to the people at the lower levels? Or is it very rigid? I know some cultures, Spain in particular, very rigid traditional hierarchies. France can be the same as well. UK, we tend to be a little bit more flexible. You know, if I see the boss, I'm allowed to say hello. In some cultures, that wouldn't be acceptable. So, how do you ensure that everyone understands that they are cared for? And how do you motivate everyone to put health and safety on their personal agenda? You know, if you've never experienced an incident or an accident, you just go on thinking everything's perfect. So how do you keep reiterating to people it's only perfect either because of luck or because our systems are working? So how do you get the message that it's actually the system is working, it's because you're following the rules that we lay down? So I'm going to do one more exercise for the last 15 minutes before we finish today. These are the questions. Maybe we'll just do, should we do the first two questions now? So it gives you about 10 minutes to discuss the first two questions. Then we'll have 5 minutes of feedback before we close, okay? Then we'll come back to the other questions tomorrow morning. So, okay? So you have 10 minutes, please start. Okay. Can someone give us some ideas? Yes? Raphael again. Okay, give him a microphone. Okay. Can I take the microphone? Okay, thank you.
Well. For the first question, our team discussed that in this case, we have contratos colectivos, ¿cómo se llama? ¿Cómo diría contratos colectivos? Well, collective contract.
Okay.
Everybody. In this case, in that kind of documents, take into account that kind of things. They have rules for this case. That's why we said that this kind of contract take into account the policy and objectives for the strategic direction of the organization. We see that. And the communication is related with the mixed commissions for safety and health that is around in our situation.
So the first one, strategic direction and policies. Who normally deals with those issues? It's usually the senior managers. Okay? So you can say, senior managers, have you made sure that your policies reflect what you think you're going to be doing in terms of your strategic direction? That's their responsibility.
Okay.
Objectives is different. Objectives, they will set the high-level corporate objectives, or again related to the strategic direction. But then for each level in the organization, you have to have personal objectives.
Yeah.
So how do those get communicated down, and how do people ensure that for their own individual cases, they have health and safety objectives? Now that's related also to the second question. How do you communicate?
The importance of good.
I mean, for example, do you have team meetings? And is health and safety issues an item that's on every team meeting agenda? Yes? No? Oh, you're nodding, no one else is. You're not from the university, so they said so quietly from behind you? Yeah, okay.
They discussed that they have two different committees, and they have these issues in these two different committees.
Okay, having committees is very nice. The people in the committees, if the committees are for health and safety, they're very interested. But how about the people who are not members of that committee? How do you communicate to them the importance of health and safety? I can give you an example. I went to visit, many years ago, a big steel manufacturing company. One of these huge plants, dirty, big fire, smoke, everything else. And they had been through a huge transformation where they had, I suppose, cut the number of people working in the site by 70% by introducing robotic machinery to deal with some of the dangerous processes. And they had a target of absolutely 0 incidents. Every street corner within the site had a pillar which indicated on it the number of accidents that day and that week and that month. And they were trying to achieve absolutely nothing on those pillars. When I visited, within their own staff, they had actually achieved that. But they still had a number of accidents with contractors who were on the site. And what they wanted to achieve was even that the contractors had no accidents. So, are there ways that you can use notice boards, public signage to indicate, you know, we've had accidents, how can we prevent this? Or how can you say to people, you know, someone got a paper cut, it's very serious, we don't want this happening again. Is there a way of reducing it? Can someone think of a solution for us as to how we prevent this in the future? So you have to be imaginative about communication. Also, in this day and age, I can see half of you on your mobile phones going, how can I get out of here quickly? You know, we have electronic communications. We have video. We have different tools compared to just a few years ago. So are there ways of getting people to use those tools for us to improve the communication message? So I need you to think about that, okay? Now I realize we're a few minutes late, but for the other questions that we're going to start with tomorrow morning, please take a look at the standard and read the clause 5.1 just to understand what the questions are relating to before we start, okay? So thank you very much for today, and I look forward to seeing you again tomorrow, okay?